Okay, I want to start by just reminding you that where we left off, you will remember that um, that there was this Greek ruler, Antiochus, and he called himself Epiphanes, which means the manifestation of God. Some of these guys had quite an ego, and he was ruling Judea in 165, and he had some very specific ideas as to what he wanted to do. He wanted to transform Jewish society into Greek society. So he passed a series of laws making it illegal for the Jews to observe the Sabbath in the normal way that they did. He made it illegal for them to make their pilgrimage to Jerusalem for the three main festivals of the Jewish year. And the most important of which, of course, was Passover. And he tried to erect a statue of the Greek god Zeus, who was the chief god in the Greek pantheon, in the Jewish temple, which for a Jew, I don't think they could think of anything worse. That would be as bad as it got. So they revolted, and this is going to happen again and again. In fact, during Jesus' lifetime alone, there was a Jewish revolt in the year 4 BC. That's probably the year he was born, although he could have been born anywhere between 6 and 4 BC. There was another revolt in 6 AD, and then there was a minor one up in Samaria during his lifetime, and then there was the major one in 66. This was a time of great turmoil among the Jews, and there were some very good reasons for that. Many of them having to do with the way they were being treated by the empires that were ruling Judea at the time. In any case, Antiochus Epiphanes was defeated by the Maccabean family, later known as the Hasmonean family, and that started the Hasmonean dynasty. And they ruled Judea from approximately the years 160. I think they defeated Antiochus around 164, and they ruled until the Romans came in somewhere between 64 and 62 BC. So they had somewhere between 90 and 100 years of independence under these Hasmonean rulers, who came from a small town just west of Jerusalem. The father initiated the rebellion. He had 4 sons, and of course they didn't have an army, so they had to engage in guerrilla warfare. And but they eventually won, and only one of the sons was left living after that, and he became the ruler of Judea for the rest of his life. And then, of course, his son would have taken over from there, and so forth. That's what it means to have a dynasty. Your eldest son becomes the next king after you die. But it didn't last very long. It like I say, lasted about 80 to 90, maybe 100 years at the most. And what happened was the Roman general Pompey, he was one of 3 generals. Now, by this time, the Roman Empire had expanded. dramatically expanded. I mean, they had already taken what was called Gaul at that time. That's modern day France. They had defeated the Carthaginians in northern Africa. So they had northern Africa. They had practically the entire Mediterranean basin was under Roman authority by this time. The Roman system of governance prior to the onset of the emperors was a system where they had a senate that was made up of the Roman aristocracy. And they were kind of a deliberative body. They would debate the issues. The most famous one, you may have heard of the most famous Roman senator. It was a guy named Cicero.
I think it's just him.
Cicero left many writings behind, and so we know quite a lot about him. But in any case, that didn't last. The Roman Senate eventually it began to lose power to the people who controlled the military. Okay, in any country where and we see this, we've seen this throughout human history. In any country, the people who control the military ultimately end up ruling, because the military can, impose its will on the rest of the population. So at the time Pompey marched into Judea. Now, if you have a map, you might want to look at it. If you don't worry about it. But one thing about Judea that's important strategically in terms of its location is that it's at the eastern end of the Mediterranean basin, north of Egypt and south of the Fertile Crescent of the Tigris and Euphrates river valleys, which is modern day Iraq. Okay, the people who lived beyond this region of modern day Israel and Syria and Jordan were called Parthians. And really the only people left in the region who were a threat to Rome in any way were these Parthians. Okay, so Pompey and they had invaded portions of Palestine, but I don't want to get into that quite yet. At the time Pompey marched into Judea with the intentions of making it another Roman province, so that they had this buffer zone between themselves and the Parthians. Okay, that's one reason they wanted. There were three Roman legions that existed at the time. Pompey was the general of one of them. Julius Caesar was the leader of one of the most powerful one, and then a guy named Cassius was the ruler of a third one. And the three of them kind of decided to rule Rome as a kind of triumvirate. Okay, so in the 40s BC, you've got General Pompey, Julius Caesar, and this Cassius ruling the Roman Empire, along with the Senate. I mean, the Senate was they still had some pull, and they could still offer advice to these guys, but they basically did whatever they wanted to. Okay, so these three decide to divide up the Roman Empire into different sections, and that never works. Okay, when you've got three very ambitious guys and each of them has an army, eventually they're going to turn on each other, and that is exactly what they did. Pompey and Cassius eventually dies, and so what's left is Julius Caesar and Pompey. So Julius Caesar goes to war with Pompey near a place called Philippi. That's a Greek city where Paul later would establish a church. And Julius Caesar defeats General Pompey, and that's pretty much the end of him. And then he returns back to Rome, and in this triumphant sort of way, and he's declared the head of the Roman Empire. He's going to be essentially a dictator at this point. Well, some of the Roman senators were troubled by this. They didn't want a dictator. They wanted the Roman Senate to continue to have some say. They were content to allow Julius Caesar to be the first among equals. I mean, that's one way to put it. But they still wanted the Senate to have a say in ruling the empire. So a conspiracy broke out. You may have heard of this. If you've ever read Shakespeare's play, Julius Caesar, there were three conspirators, the most famous one being Brutus, a guy named Brutus, because he was supposedly a personal friend of Julius Caesar. But in any case, on the Ides of March, that's March 15th, Julius Caesar is assassinated by these three conspirators. Okay, and things become rather chaotic for a time after that. So what happens is Julius Caesar's nearest relative is a grand nephew by the name of Octavian. And another general, a general by the name of Mark Antony, joins forces with Octavian to go after the conspirators who murdered Julius Caesar. This is where we're going to start to get a connection with Palestine. One of those conspirators ends up connected to a man named Herod. Okay, now Herod was an Idumean nobleman. Idumea was a little country just south of Palestine and consisted of what is called the Negev Desert and parts of what is now Jordan. Okay, that was called Idumea. And Herod, at the time, he was a nobleman, and actually he was ruling up in Galilee, but he had ambitions to rule all of Judea, from Galilee all the way south to the border with Idumea, where he came from. So this conspirator who is being pursued by Octavian and Mark Antony, he comes to Herod, and Herod helps him raise an army. And there is a series of battles. Unfortunately for Brutus and the other conspirator, I forget his name now, they lost the battle to Mark Antony and Octavian. And whenever a Roman general loses a battle, what do? They commit suicide. So that's what he did. He committed suicide, and that was the end of the conspirators who had assassinated Julius Caesar. So now we've got Mark Antony and Octavian ruling the Roman Empire. But once again, you see, you've got two very ambitious people, each with their own army, and eventually things aren't going to turn out very well. What happens is Mark Antony falls in love with Cleopatra, who is the queen of Egypt. He moves to Egypt, marries Cleopatra, and divorces his former wife. But unfortunately, his former wife happens to be the sister of Octavia. So this enrages Octavia, right? And he declares war against Mark Antony. So now you've got another civil war on your hands. This time between Octavia and Mark Antony and Cleopatra. Well, there is a final naval battle off the coast of Egypt, a place called Actium. And the Egyptian Navy is not equal to the Roman Navy. So Octavian defeats Mark Antony and Cleopatra, and they do their duty, and each of them commits suicide, and that is the end of that. Octavian returns back to Rome. The sole ruler of the Roman Empire, and the Roman Senate declares him Augustus, which means the august one. Okay, and he takes the name of his grand uncle Julius Caesar, and he takes the name Caesar Augustus. Okay, Caesar Augustus begins to rule the Roman Empire in 27 BC, and he rules it all the way until he dies in the year 12 AD. Okay, so that's, by ancient standards, that is a very, very long time to be a ruler. From 27 to 12, that would be 39 years. That's a long time. The reason Caesar Augustus was so important to the Roman Empire, though, was because of what he did during those 39 years. During those 39 years, he decides he's going to create an empire that has a thriving economy. And the way he's going to do that is he's going to build a series of roads that will enable people from all the different regions of the empire to engage in trade. And so the Romans build miles and miles and miles of paved roads during Caesar's time. And he connects all the different disparate parts of the empire. He connects them together through these series of roads that he builds. And the other thing he does is the Roman Empire has a lot of people to feed, right? So what he does is he goes into areas where there are small farms, okay, and he consolidates them into big, large estates. And the reason he does that is because if you have a big, large agricultural enterprise, you can be more productive and produce more food than if you have a tiny, small farm. It's a little bit like, you know, my dad's brother, his name was Elton. During World War II, my dad went off to the Navy, and Elton got a medical deferment. So he stayed home and farmed the home site where my dad and he grew up. The farm was around 600 acres, a little over 600 acres. And back in those days, a family could farm 600 acres and make a go of it. Today in North Dakota, you've got to have 2,000 or 3,000 acres to make a go of it.
True.
So all of these small farmers now, they've either acquired enough land so they've got thousands of acres, or they rent their land to agribusinesses, and they farm, thousands and thousands of acres, and are thereby able to produce much more of the commodity that they're growing and earn more money at the marketplace. So anyway, so Julius Caesar does something similar in the Roman Empire. Okay, so there's a lot of changes going on throughout the Roman Empire during this period. Now, let's go back to Judea. Herod, who is sometimes called Herod the Great because of all of his building projects, okay? Herod was ruling Galilee. Now, at the time that Mark Antony and Octavian went to war, Herod unfortunately took the wrong side. He sided with Mark Antony. And when Mark Antony was defeated, now Herod is in a very precarious position, because Octavian could just sentence him to death and be done with it. But what Herod does is very shrewd. What he does, and those of you who went to Israel might be interested to know that this story was first told to me by Gila when I think this was the second trip I made to Israel, and we were in the theater in Caesarea, which is on the coast. It's one of the cities that Herod built, and she told us this story. What happened is that Herod traveled to Rome, okay, after Octavian won that battle. He traveled to Rome, and he managed to get I don't know if you'd call it an appointment. He managed to get some time in front of the Roman Senate to argue his case, okay? And of course, Octavian, or Caesar Augustus, was present at the time. So essentially what Herod says is, during the Civil War, I pledged my faithfulness to Mark Antony, and I supported him every step of the way. And then he turns to Octavian and he says, and I will serve you in the same way that I served him. In other words, I will serve you, Caesar Augustus, and do your bidding in the same way that I was faithful to your former foe, Mark Antony. Well, both the Roman Senate and Octavian are so impressed with Herod that they declare him at this point, this is 37 AD, or 37 BC, they declare Herod the Great the king of the Jews. Okay, so the Romans give Herod jurisdiction over governing Judea and all of what we now call the Holy Land, from Galilee all the way south to the southern desert. That is now Herod's kingdom. All right. And Herod rules with an iron fist. But what he's most noted for is his building projects. He wants to turn Judea into a very impressive kingdom. Okay, so among his building projects are the following. His most impressive was Caesarea. If you have a map, you can see Caesarea along the Mediterranean coast. Palestine does not have a natural harbor, so he actually built one. He hired engineers and he built an artificial harbor right out into the sea. And then he built the city and he named it Caesarea, of course, after Caesar, currying favor with Caesar. And that becomes, after Jerusalem, the principal city of Palestine and the city where later the Roman governors will live. In fact, not that long ago, archaeologists unearthed a big stone with a familiar name on it, Pontius Pilate. So we know that it was a Greco-Roman city, Caesarea. Caesar Augustus, just like his predecessors, wanted to sort of Hellenize the whole Roman Empire. So the cities were built after the Greek method of building cities. You had a theater, you had a gymnasium, you had a forum in the middle where all the merchants were, and it was a columned street, and then the neighborhoods around the side. All the cities, big and small, were built on this model. And Herod did the same thing in Judea as well. In fact, he added in Jerusalem a theater and a gymnasium, much to the chagrin of many of the Jews who lived there at the time, by the way. Okay, so his first major building project was that city, Caesarea. He also built two major fortresses out in the desert, one called Masada. Some of you have been to the top of Masada. That was a big, huge palace with all the accoutrements, a place that he could go for whenever he wanted a retreat into the desert. It was at the top of a high, plateau of sorts. Another one called the Macarius. He built several of them out there. But his most famous building project, when the Jews returned after exile, they rebuilt Solomon's temple, but it was very small. Wasn't very impressive. So Herod decides that he wants to build something that could be considered one of the wonders of the ancient world. So he builds this enormous temple out of pure white stone so that the sun reflects off it, makes it look, very pure, very sacred. And it's got gold accoutrements around it. And then around the temple, there are courtyards, okay? And this is done according to Jewish law. There's a courtyard on the outer part of the temple where Gentiles are allowed. Then the next courtyard, there's a fence, and then there's a sign there that says if you're a Gentile and you cross this fence, you're going to lose your life, okay? So most people didn't cross the fence. On the next side was the courtyard of the women. Okay, so that's where Jewish women could congregate during festivals and during times when people made pilgrimages to Jerusalem. And then there was an inner courtyard right in front of where the priests would make all the sacrifices on the altar that was outside. So for example, itself. Suppose you had come to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. What would happen is that in the outer courtyards, the Temple Mount is absolutely enormous, many football fields big. On the outer part of the courtyards, there were animals to purchase for sacrificing. But in order to purchase something at the temple, it had to be a Jewish shekel, because other currencies were minted with pictures of individuals on them, whether it be the Roman emperor or somebody else. And the Jews considered that a violation of the commandment against making graven images. So you had to change your money. If you came from, say, Egypt, you had to change your money out of Egyptian currency into shekels before you could buy the animal that you would have sacrificed to celebrate the Passover. So first you would go to the money changers. These were the guys that in that famous episode in Jesus' life where, he overchanges the tables of the money changers. That was these guys, okay? Because they were corrupt. When people exchanged their money, they always gave them a terrible rate, and they made a lot of dishonest money doing this. Okay. And then say, so if you're there for Passover, you would then purchase a sheep, and you would take it to the priests that were serving in the temple. Okay, now there were 24 guilds of priests that would serve alternatively throughout the year. Okay, the guild if you were a priest, you belonged to one of these 24 guilds. And your guild would have a certain amount of time, and then that was it. Another guild would take over. Okay, so you would present this sheep that you bought on the Temple Mount to the priest. It would be sacrificed on the altar, and then you would receive the meat, and you could take it wherever you were going to go to celebrate the Passover. So the temple was a very busy place, and extremely Herod built an extremely impressive structure, and it's called the Second Temple because it comes after the time of Solomon. So among all of Herod's building projects, that was the most impressive. Now, the question arises, of course, where did Herod get all this money to build cities and to build temples and to build fortresses and to build palaces? In Jerusalem, he also built a huge palace called the Antonio Fortress. Where did he get the money to build all these things? Well, okay, this is where we're going to start to connect to the ministry of Jesus. Most of the land in Palestine that is productive is north of Jerusalem. Okay, so you've got Samaria and Galilee north of Jerusalem. These areas have fertile soil, and they get sufficient rainfall, and there's 3 growing seasons, so they can produce a lot of produce and wheat and barley and all. Where did Herod get his money? He taxed the farmers. Okay, so they could pay in kind, which means that a certain portion of their produce would have to be turned over to the tax collector, and then they would sell it. Or you could pay in money after you had raised your crop and sold it. All right. But the problem with this, especially for the Galilean peasants, the problem is that most of them had just enough land. The average was 5 to 6 acres to feed a family of 4. So if you start taxing them too much, what's going to happen is that they're going to have to mortgage their property to hold on to it, because they're not going to make enough money to both pay the taxes and feed their families. And guess who borrowed them the money so that they could pay the tax or buy seeds for the next year's crop or whatever it was? Guess who those guys were? Well, you've heard of them. They're called tax collectors. All right. It was the tax collectors. It was the tax collectors who had the income, enough income to borrow money at enormous interest rates. 25 to 50% was not unusual for an interest rate, to these poor Galilean peasants who had absolutely no choice. Okay, so they would borrow this money, and eventually they couldn't pay it back, and the tax collector would foreclose on them and sell the land to a large landowner, so that over time, many of the small farmers up in Galilee lost their farms, and large landowners would raise, huge amounts of crops, and it was mostly for export, because that's how you made money, right? By exporting it, and the Romans needed these agricultural areas to feed the people in all of these big cities they had. They got most of their wheat to make bread came from Egypt, but some of it came from Palestine, and a lot of the produce came from Palestine. And the other interesting thing that came from Palestine, that was considered a delicacy in Rome, was fish. Okay, in the Sea of Galilee, the fish that was most prized was tilapia. Okay, today they call it St. Peter's fish. So what the fishermen would do is they would take their catch to the town of Magdala, which is on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee. It's where Mary Magdalene came from. And there the fish would be salted to preserve it. It would be boxed up and then exported to other places in the Roman Empire. And this was quite popular. Okay, so my point is that what's happening in Galilee in the years before Jesus is born and in the years during his ministry, what's happening is that a class society is starting to develop. Okay, you've got large numbers of poor former peasant farmers who have lost their land and who now work either as day laborers, who may work together with some others trying to catch some fish on the Sea of Galilee, or they may work as tenant farmers, where they share the produce with the owner, the landowner. There was a few choices they could make, but not a lot. Okay. And the other thing that's happening is that because many of these poorer people can't afford to buy the necessary food for a balanced diet, what you're getting is a lot of malnutrition. And when you've got malnutrition, certain kinds of problems begin to crop up that weren't there previously. You've got birth defects from babies who are born. Some are born blind. You might remember the story of the blind man who was born blind in the Gospel of John. That was probably because his mother was malnourished. You've got all of these people who are either paralyzed or sick in a variety of different ways. Have you ever wondered when you read the Gospels and it says, and then Jesus went to a deserted place, and all of a sudden there were thousands of people around him? Have you ever wondered who those people were? Well, that's who they were. It was it was mostly these people who had been stripped of their ability to earn their own living, and many of them were sick. And so obviously Jesus, with a reputation as a healer, a lot of them are going to come to him, and they're following him around wherever he goes. He draws a huge crowd, and he associates with all of the lower classes of society, and this irritates the people who are in the upper classes. There were two cities there where the wealthy people lived, and Jesus never set foot apparently in either one. At least according to the Gospels, they never mentions that he ever set foot in either one. He goes to the villages where the common people live, and that's where he does his preaching, his teaching, and his healing. But in any case, okay, so this started under Caesar Augustus, and it continued under Herod, because Herod levied heavy taxes to build all of these impressive structures that he was famous for. Okay, so got about 8 minutes left. What I want to do with those 8 minutes now is talk about the religious situation in Palestine just before Jesus was born. Okay. Now, we get the idea that he was born somewhere between 5 and 4 BC, because according to Matthew, Herod is still alive when Jesus is born. Remember when the wise men come and they say, we followed a star because the king of the Jews has been born? Well, Herod gets all nervous about that because he thinks that's a threat to his power. So he kills all the children in and around Bethlehem when he finds out that Jesus supposedly was born in Bethlehem. Mary and Joseph and Jesus had fled to Egypt before he could get to him, according to the story. So we believe that he was born somewhere in that area, okay, between 6 and 4. My personal opinion, if I had to, my personal opinion is that he was probably born in the year 4. And the reason I say that is because according to Luke, Jesus comes to John the Baptist to be baptized in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, who came after Caesar Augustus. And that is the year 28. So if Jesus was born in the year 4, that would mean he started his ministry at age 32. Well, that makes more sense to me than if he'd been born in the year 5 or 6 and he started his ministry at age 33 or 34 or whatever, because people, the life expectancy at that time was not that high, and I just personally think he would have started it earlier rather than later. Okay, now the religious situation at the time. Last week we talked a little bit about 2 of the religious groups in Palestine at the time of Herod. There was no religion of Judaism yet at the time. There were sects, there were Jewish sects. Okay. You might remember that the Sadducees were the wealthy Jerusalem families who ran the temple. Okay. For them, the temple was the most important aspect of Jewish life, and they ran everything that went on in the area of the temple. And because they were Roman collaborators, the Romans agreed to always choose the high priest from among that group. Okay, so a Sadducee was always the high priest. Okay, so there was the Sadducees. They were limited to Jerusalem. Then there was the Pharisees. The Pharisees were the guys who believed that the center of Jewish life was Mosaic law. Okay, and they debated the meaning of the laws. They observed them as strictly as possible, and they taught others to do the same. They were very, very strict when it came to observing the rules of both ritual cleanliness, dietary rules, garments you wear, the whole ball of wax. The Pharisees followed the law to a T. Okay. And they weren't limited to any one part of Palestine. They were interspersed throughout. They could have been poor, they could have been rich, they could have been from a little village, they could have been from a city. Okay. Because the point was that they were dedicated to the law, not to any one place or any one thing. All right. Now, the group that we didn't talk about, that I want to mention briefly, that'll help set the stage now for moving on to the New Testament, is a group called the Essenes. Okay. The Essenes were a group of Jews. There wasn't very many of them. Maybe the estimates are that there were maybe around, I don't know, 70,000 at most throughout the whole country. But in any case, most of you have heard about the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay, the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in these caves above the Dead Sea. What had happened is that a Bedouin, these are shepherds, you can see them in Israel to this day, especially along the road between Jericho and Jerusalem. A shepherd boy lost track of a goat, and he was searching for this goat. So he thought, well, maybe the goat wandered into this cave. So he threw a rock into the cave, and the rock went clink, like it hit a metal object, right? So he got curious, and he walked in the cave, and he found all of these metal jars. And inside the metal jars were these ancient scrolls. Okay. Now, this shepherd boy didn't know what these things were, obviously, but he was smart enough to know that you could make a lot of money on the black market selling antiquities. All right. So he went back to the elders, and they started searching these caves, and they found, by the time they were finished, they searched all these caves, and by this time it had become more widely known. It wasn't just the shepherds who were searching. They found fragments of every book in the Old Testament with the exception of Esther. Now, the reason this is so important is because prior to this time, the oldest manuscripts we had of the Old Testament were copied centuries later, like in the 500s or 600s AD. Those were the oldest manuscripts we had. These manuscripts date from the 1st century. Okay, so these are the real McCoy. All right. They got the total scroll of the prophet Isaiah, complete scroll. And then, like I say, at least fragments of every other book of the Bible. Okay, well, where did these scrolls come from? Well, what happened was there was a group of Essenes. Now, the Essenes were people who believed that those who were running the temple were corrupt. And they believed that in order to live a pure life before God, they had to get out away from the corruption that was going on in Jerusalem. And they established a community on the banks of the Dead Sea called Qumran. Okay. And we know it's an Essene community because it's got all of these ritual bathing chambers and a chamber where the scribes would have been copying these manuscripts and all of these things. Okay. So there was an Essene community on the banks of the Dead Sea at this settlement called Qumran. And in 66 AD, when the Romans came through during the Jewish-Roman War, what they did was they collected all of their scrolls and they hid them in these caves before the Romans got there. And they weren't discovered again until 1948 or whatever it was. Okay, so they had been sitting there for like almost 2,000 years. It was an amazing find. All right, so then what we've got among the Jews, and I'll close with this. At the time Jesus is born, then we've got the Sadducees running the temple. They believe in the first 5 books of Moses, not in any of the others. And they don't believe in life after death. They don't believe there's such a thing as resurrection. Okay? Because they can't find it anywhere in the books of Moses. Then you've got the Pharisees. They accept all the books that we call the Old Testament. And they do believe in the resurrection. Because it's in the book of Daniel, okay? And the center of their life is Jewish law. So you got the Sadducees centered in the temple. You got the Pharisees centered in Jewish law. And then you've got the Essenes. And really, for them, the central aspect of Jewish life was the land, okay? The land that was promised and given to the children of Abraham, the children of Israel, the chosen people. That was kind of the center of Jewish life for them. Okay, so you've got these different aspects of Jewish groups, each emphasizing a different aspect of what's important to Jewish identity. The land, the law, and the temple. And into this cauldron, in the year 28 AD, there appears an eschatological prophet by the name of John the Baptist. And we'll pick it up there next time.